At 5:55 in the evening, Tokyo time, on April 13, 1943, a radio operator at the Combined Fleet Headquarters in Rabaul keyed a message into the Pacific night. The transmission was encrypted in JN-25D, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher, and addressed to 3 separate commands in the Northern Solomons, the commanders at Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotilla, and the 26th Air Flotilla. Its content was administrative in form. A senior officer would be traveling to the forward air bases. His departure time was set. His aircraft type was named. His escort was listed to the number and type of machines. His arrival time at each stop was fixed to the minute. The officer who had drafted the message was Commander Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer serving aboard the Combined Fleet flagship under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The schedule he transmitted belonged to Yamamoto himself, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. The officer, American Naval Intelligence had identified in classified assessments as the most capable strategic mind in the Japanese service. Watanabe specified every operational detail. Departure from Rabaul at 0600 on April 18 in one of 2 Mitsubishi Betty bombers from the 705th Naval Air Group, escorted by 6 Zero fighters from the 204th Naval Air Group. Arrival at Ballali Airfield near Bougainville at 0800. A subchaser crossing from Ballali to Shortland Island at 0840. Forward to Buin for a final inspection of pilots who had flown in the recent air offensive. Return by air to Rabaul at 1400. If weather intervened, the schedule would shift by 1 day. Watanabe took one precaution that mattered and one that did not. He ordered the message transmitted only through Imperial Navy communications channels, not through the Imperial Japanese Army's radio network, which the Navy had long considered less disciplined about cipher security. He did not know at the time, and was appalled to discover afterward, that the message had been relayed through an Army circuit as well, using a lower-grade code. What he could not have known was that the precaution was irrelevant. The Americans were already reading JN-25D, 1,700 miles to the east, at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific compound on the grounds of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The transmission entered the intercept stream within hours. The unit, still called Station Hypo by the men who worked inside its windowless basement, broke earlier versions of the JN-25 system in time to provide the intelligence that shaped the American victory at Midway in June 1942. The current version of the cipher, designated D by the American cryptanalysts, carried a fresh additive book introduced on April 1, 1943. For 12 days, the codebreakers worked to recover readability in the new traffic. Yamamoto's itinerary arrived at the moment. Partial solutions were beginning to yield coherent Japanese text. The unit's chief Japanese language analyst, Marine Officer Alva Laswell, read the partially decrypted fragments. The picture assembled itself from broken phrases and recovered code groups, a departure time, an aircraft type, a fighter escort count, a route laid out stop by stop across the Northern Solomons, and a name that required no additional context: Yamamoto. Laswell is recorded by Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, in Layton's 1985 memoir And I Was There, as having turned to his colleagues and spoken 3 words: "We have hit the jackpot." Within hours, Layton had the working translation in his hands and carried it across the Pearl Harbor compound to the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The scheduling signal that Commander Watanabe had drafted in Rabaul for routine distribution to 3 subordinate commands had become the most consequential intercept of the Pacific War. If this kind of documented record matters to you, the like button is what tells the algorithm to put it in front of the people who care about the archive, not the legend. The cipher that carried the message was not new to American intelligence, and its history is part of the story. JN-25 was a 5-digit operational code the Imperial Japanese Navy had maintained in evolving versions since the late 1930s. The basic architecture used a codebook of roughly 33,000 5-digit groups, each group representing a Japanese word, a standard naval phrase, or a numeral. Over that base layer, the Japanese applied an additive table, a separate set of 5-digit groups that were arithmetically added to the code groups before transmission. The resulting enciphered text was, in theory, unreadable, without both the codebook and the correct additive table. Each time the Japanese introduced a new additive book, the American codebreakers lost readability and began the laborious process of recovering the new additives by exploiting patterns in the traffic, stereotyped message openings, repeated address groups, and the mathematical regularity that emerged when large volumes of intercepts were compared against one another. The technique was called stripping, and it worked because the underlying code groups remained constant even when the additive layer changed. The Americans were not breaking the additives by brute computational force. They were peeling them away by recognizing the structural fingerprints of the codebook beneath. The Japanese considered the system unbreakable. Their confidence rested on two assumptions that reinforced each other and that no internal review ever challenged. The first was mathematical, a belief that the two-layer architecture of codebook plus additive placed the traffic beyond any adversary's analytical reach, particularly given that the additive books were changed at intervals. The second was cultural, and it ran deeper. Japanese naval intelligence believed that the Japanese language itself, with its multiple writing systems, its contextual ambiguities, and its distance from any Western linguistic tradition, formed an additional barrier that no foreign intelligence service could penetrate even if the mathematical layer were somehow stripped away. This second assumption was the more dangerous one. It discouraged the kind of rigorous internal testing in which the Navy's own analysts would attempt to break JN-25 from the outside that might have revealed the system's actual vulnerability. The Americans, who had recruited and trained several hundred linguists, translators, and traffic analysts specifically to defeat both layers, understood how deeply the Japanese trusted this premise. They treated the enemy's faith in his own cipher as a strategic asset and worked to protect it with a discipline that matched anything they applied to the cipher work itself. The inspection tour that generated the fatal message grew from an air offensive Yamamoto had personally directed. In the first 2 weeks of April 1943, the combined fleet launched Operation Igo, a concentrated series of airstrikes that sent several hundred Japanese naval aircraft against Allied shipping and airfields across the Solomons and eastern New Guinea. The operation was Yamamoto's attempt to blunt the American advance up the Solomon chain by destroying enough shipping, aircraft, and base infrastructure to slow the build-up at Guadalcanal and in the Papua region. Strikes ran from April 7 through April 14, targeting shipping in the waters around Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and Oro Bay in New Guinea. The Japanese aircrews who flew these missions returned to Rabaul with spectacular claims. They reported dozens of Allied transports and warships sunk and scores of aircraft destroyed in the air or on the ground. The actual results, verified against Allied records after the war, were a fraction of what was claimed. The Americans lost the destroyer Aaron Ward, the tanker Kanawha, the New Zealand corvette Moa, and a handful of smaller vessels. Japanese aircrew losses, by contrast, were significant and difficult to replace. But Yamamoto accepted the inflated claims as they were reported upward through his air commands. The pattern of exaggerated combat reports was endemic in the Japanese air services by this stage of the war. Pilots overcounted in the confusion of combat. Squadron commanders aggregated the overcounts. Flotilla commanders passed the aggregated figures to fleet headquarters without the downward correction that an honest assessment would have required. Yamamoto, who before the war had displayed a cold-eyed understanding of the arithmetic of attrition, did not in April 1943 subject his aircrew's reports to the scrutiny they deserved. The decision to visit the forward air bases followed from those claims. Yamamoto intended to congratulate his pilots in person for what he believed was a significant operational success. The tour would take him to Balai, Shortland, and Buin, the staging fields from which Igo sorties had launched. The itinerary would carry him through airspace that his staff treated as secure, partly because it lay within the defensive perimeter of Japanese air cover from Bougainville, and partly because the nearest American fighter base at Guadalcanal was, by their assessment, too far away for American fighters to reach. That assessment was wrong, and it was wrong because of a single aircraft type. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine, twin-boom interceptor that the United States Army Air Forces had deployed to the Pacific beginning in late 1942. Japanese pilots knew the aircraft by sight. Its distinctive silhouette, two fuselage booms flanking a central nacelle, was unmistakable in the air and had been encountered over Guadalcanal, in the Aleutians, and along the New Guinea coast. Japanese aviators had given it a wary respect. The Lightning was fast, heavily armed with a concentrated nose battery of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, and it climbed well at altitude. But what Japanese intelligence had not fully reckoned with was the aircraft's range. The P-38 was designed from the outset as a long-range interceptor. Its twin Allison engines and its internal fuel capacity gave it a combat radius that no single-engine American fighter in the Pacific theater could approach. With external drop tanks, a P-38G model could fly a round trip of 1,000 miles or more and still arrive at the far end with enough fuel for a short, violent engagement. The P-38's first combat in the Pacific had come in August 1942, when two Lightnings of the 343rd Fighter Group, 11th Air Force, destroyed a pair of Japanese Kawanishi flying boats near Kiska in the Aleutian Islands at the end of a 1,000-mile patrol. The engagement was notable less for its tactical significance than for what it demonstrated about the aircraft's reach. A 1,000-mile patrol was routine for a P-38. It was inconceivable for a Wildcat. By April 1943, the Lightning was operational across the South and Southwest Pacific, flying escort missions, interceptions, and long-range sweeps that no other American fighter type in the theater could attempt. Japanese intelligence tracked the aircraft's deployment but appears not to have updated its assessments of American fighter range to account for what the P-38 could do with external fuel. Japanese tactical assessments of American fighter capability in the Solomons appear to have been anchored to the single-engine types the Navy and Marine Corps flew from Henderson Field, the F-4F Wildcat, and the newer F-4U Corsair. Neither aircraft could have reached Bougainville from Guadalcanal and returned. The staff officers who plotted Yamamoto's inspection route through the northern Solomons treated the 400 miles between Henderson Field and Balhail as a margin of safety. If their intelligence had accounted for the P-38's extended range with drop tanks, the route and its schedule would have looked different. The surviving record does not indicate that anyone on Yamamoto's staff raised the question of whether an American twin-engine fighter could close that distance. Others raised different questions. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, the senior army commander in the Rabaul area, had barely survived an aerial ambush while flying between forward bases a month earlier. He urged Yamamoto to cancel the inspection. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa offered a substantially larger fighter escort than the 6 Zeros Watanabe had scheduled. Yamamoto refused. Rear Admiral Takatsugu Joshima reportedly flew to Rabaul in person to press the admiral not to go, calling the radioed itinerary an open invitation to the enemy. Yamamoto overruled them all. The tour was connected to the IGO congratulatory mission. He considered the visit to his pilots a matter of obligation, and he was not a man who reconsidered obligations. He was also a man of rigid punctuality, and this was the detail that made the intercept lethal. Commander Layton, briefing Admiral Nimitz, emphasized the point. If the decrypted schedule said Yamamoto would arrive at Balhail at 0800, he would arrive at 0800. The times in the intercept were not planning estimates subject to revision. They were commitments the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet would honor to the minute. They were appointments the Americans could keep as well. Layton's recommendation to Nimitz went beyond the tactical opportunity. The case for the strike rested on Yamamoto's irreplaceability. He was not simply a fleet commander. He was the only senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy who had lived in the United States, who had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, who had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, and who had observed American shipyards, factories, and oil infrastructure with his own eyes. He had drawn conclusions from that observation that no other Japanese flag officer shared. In the autumn of 1940, months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto had told Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono that if Japan were forced into war with the United States, he could run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year, but he had no confidence whatsoever for the second or third year. The remark survived through Konoe's own later account and was cited by Hiroyuki Agawa in The Reluctant Admiral, first published in Japanese in 1969 and translated into English by John Bester in 1979. It was the most clear-eyed pre-war assessment of the war's trajectory that any Japanese leader produced, and the man who made it was now flying into an ambush his own staff had arranged. Layton told Nimitz that Yamamoto's successor would be a lesser commander. The loss would not be replaced. The question Nimitz had to weigh was whether killing the most dangerous man in the Japanese Navy was worth the risk of revealing to the enemy that JN-25 had been broken. If the Japanese concluded from the precision of the ambush that their cipher was compromised, they would replace the entire system, and the advantage American intelligence had been exploiting since before Midway, the ability to read Japanese operational traffic in near real time, would vanish overnight. Everything the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and Melbourne had built, the painstaking recovery of code groups, the reconstruction of additive tables, the institutional knowledge of Japanese communications procedures, accumulated over years, would have to begin again from scratch against a new and unknown cipher. The strategic cost of losing that readability could be measured in ships sunk, aircraft lost, and months of war prolonged. Nimitz weighed that cost against the certainty of removing Yamamoto and the probability, assessed by Layton, that the Japanese would attribute the ambush to something other than code-breaking. Nimitz consulted Admiral William Halsey, who commanded the South Pacific area from Noumea. Halsey's endorsement, referenced by the Naval History and Heritage Command's director Samuel Cox in H-Gram 018, published in April 2018, was forceful and unambiguous. With Halsey's authorization in hand, Nimitz approved the mission. The bet was that the Japanese would find some other explanation for the ambush, and the cipher would continue to serve American intelligence after the admiral was dead. The operational chain ran from Nimitz to Halsey, to Rear Admiral Mark Mitscher, the commander of air forces in the Solomons, based at Guadalcanal. Mitscher assigned the mission to Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group. Mitchell received the tasking on April 17 and had less than 24 hours to plan it. Mitchell plotted a route that was itself a piece of navigational art, to avoid Japanese radar installations along the more direct path and to stay clear of coastwatcher stations that might report a large American fighter formation headed north. He drew a dogleg course that swung west out over the open Solomon Sea, then turned north toward Bougainville at a point well beyond the range of Japanese ground observers. The outbound leg covered roughly 600 miles, all of it flown at 30 to 50 feet above the water in absolute radio silence. Navigation would depend entirely on compass headings, a clock, and calculated airspeed. There would be no radio contact, no landmarks over the open ocean, no opportunity to correct a heading error that would place the formation in the wrong piece of sky at the wrong minute. The aircraft would carry 2 drop tanks each, one 310-gallon and one 165-gallon, the larger tanks flown in from General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Theater the night before, because Guadalcanal's own fuel stores lacked enough of the correct size. 18 P-38s were assigned to the mission. Mitchell led a top-cover element of 14 aircraft, whose job was to engage the Japanese escort and hold the Zeros away from the bombers. A 4-plane killer section, tasked with making the attack on the Bettys, comprised Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. 2 aircraft never made it off the ground on the morning of the mission. One pilot blew a tire on the coral strip at Fighter 2. Another found his drop tanks would not feed. 16 P-38s took off at 7:25 on the morning of April 18, 1943, climbed to minimum altitude, and headed west over the water. The flight that followed was 2 hours of sustained concentration at a height that left no margin for mechanical failure, navigational error, or loss of attention. At 30 to 50 feet above the ocean, a momentary lapse in altitude awareness meant contact with the water at over 200 miles per hour. The pilots flew in a loose formation, engines throttled back to conserve fuel on the long outbound leg, watching one another's aircraft for any sign of a drop tank feeding problem or an engine running rough. The compass headings Mitchell had calculated required precise timing at each turn point. A deviation of 2 degrees sustained over 400 miles would place the formation miles from the intercept point. There was no way to verify position over the featureless ocean. They flew on trust, on Mitchell's arithmetic, and on the assumption that Yamamoto was as punctual as his reputation promised. Mitchell had calculated an intercept time over Empress Augusta Bay on the western coast of Bougainville. The calculated time was 9:34, local. He hit it within 1 minute. At 9:34, the flight spotted the Japanese formation exactly where the decrypted schedule said it would be. 2 Betty bombers in a shallow descent toward Balal at roughly 4,500 feet. 6 Zeros stepped above and behind in escort formation. The P-38s were still on the deck, their dark paint merging with the ocean surface below. Mitchell's navigation over 400 miles of open water, with no landmarks and no radio, had placed 16 fighters at the intercept point, with an error margin measured in seconds. Lanphier and Barber jettisoned their drop tanks and pulled into a climbing turn toward the bombers. The Zeros saw them and broke formation, some rolling down to engage the top cover, others turning toward the killer section. The escort pilots had been assigned to protect the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and they understood what the stakes were. But they were 6 fighters against 16, and the Americans had the advantage of surprise, speed from below, and a 4-plane element dedicated solely to reaching the bombers. The Zeros could not be everywhere at once. What followed lasted roughly 90 seconds, and the sequence of events has been disputed across 8 decades, but the outcome is documented beyond question. The lead Betty, the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto, took sustained 50 caliber fire from behind and below. Its left engine trailed a thick ribbon of dark smoke. The bomber rolled left and dove into the jungle canopy northwest of Bougainville. The second Betty, carrying Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the combined fleet's chief of staff, was hit in a separate pass and crash-landed in the sea off Moila Point. Of the 11 men aboard the 2 bombers, Yamamoto and most of the crew of the first aircraft were killed instantly or in the crash. Ugaki survived with severe injuries, dragged from the surf along with the pilot and 1 other officer. The only American loss was Lieutenant Raymond Hine, whose P-38 did not return from the engagement and was never found. The question of who fired the shots that brought down Yamamoto's bomber consumed American military politics for decades afterward. Lanphier claimed the kill publicly and held to his claim until his death. Barber disputed it with equal persistence. The modern historical consensus, supported by the post-war testimony of Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya, the sole surviving Japanese fighter escort pilot from the engagement, and by trajectory analysis of the bullet damage to the recovered wreckage, credits Barber with the fatal pass. The United States Air Force split the credit between the 2 men in a 1993 ruling that satisfied neither side and resolved nothing. The physical evidence and the Japanese eyewitness account favor Barber. The most direct surviving testimony from the Japanese side of the air engagement comes through Vice Admiral Ugaki, reconstructed years later and preserved in Agawa's biography. Ugaki, in the second Betty, saw the P-38s climbing toward the lead aircraft. He grabbed the shoulder of the air staff officer beside him, pointed at the commander-in-chief's plane, and in the next instant the aircraft was gone. A column of black smoke rose from the jungle canopy below. Ugaki's words, as rendered in the published account, compressed the event to a single line. Everything was over now. Ugaki kept a diary throughout the war, a document of enormous scope and daily discipline. It was published in English in 1991 as Fading Victory by the University of Pittsburgh Press, edited by Donald Goldstein and Catherine Dillon, translated by Masataka Chihaya, with a foreword by Gordon Prange. The diary covers the war from Pearl Harbor through the last day of fighting. It contains no entries from mid-April 1943 through February 1944. The gap spans Ugaki's hospitalization and convalescence. Whatever he thought about how the Americans had materialized at the exact point and minute of Yamamoto's descent, he did not record it. Or if he did, the pages have never been released by his family or by the archives that hold the original manuscript. When Ugaki resumed writing in 1944, and through the final 18 months of war that followed, his diary entries recorded operational frustrations, strategic assessments, and increasingly bitter reflections on the war's direction. He recorded losses, command decisions, and the grinding attrition of Japanese air strength. He did not, in any passage that has appeared in the published English translation, return to the question of how the Americans had known Yamamoto's schedule. The event that nearly killed him and that killed the commander he served appears in the diary as a wound from which he recovered, not as a mystery he pursued. A Japanese army search party led by Lieutenant Hamasuna pushed through the Bougainville jungle the following morning, April 19, guided by the smoke column that had been visible the day before. The crash site was in dense tropical forest northwest of Bouin. The Betty had torn through the canopy and broken apart on impact. Wreckage was scattered across a wide area. Yamamoto's body had been thrown clear and was found upright in his seat beneath a tree, still in his green uniform, his white-gloved hand resting on the hilt of his katana, his head inclined forward as if in thought. The image was recorded by the search party and transmitted to the combined fleet staff. A naval medical team conducted a post-mortem examination and recorded 2 .50-caliber wounds, one entering the back of the left shoulder and one entering the lower left jaw and exiting above the right eye. The medical officers judged the head wound instantly fatal, sustained in the air before the aircraft struck the ground. The physical evidence indicated that Yamamoto had been killed by gunfire during the engagement, not by the crash itself. Agawa noted, drawing on the medical team's accounts and on interviews conducted decades later with surviving members of the recovery party, that the published autopsy report was altered on orders from above to spare the Japanese public the full extent of the wounds. Yamamoto's remains were cremated at Bouin, transported to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi, and given a state funeral in Tokyo on June 5, 1943. It was only the second state funeral accorded a Japanese naval officer, after Admiral Heihachiro Togo. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral and awarded the Grand Cordon of the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. The government withheld the announcement of his death until May 21, more than 5 weeks after the event, while the combined fleet reorganized its command structure and managed the shock within its own ranks. The delay was deliberate. Yamamoto's name carried a weight in Japanese public consciousness that no other military figure of the war matched. He was the man who had struck Pearl Harbor, the face of Japanese naval power in the popular imagination. The Navy Ministry feared that premature disclosure would damage home front morale at a moment when the war's trajectory was already turning against Japan. When the announcement finally came, it was accompanied by a carefully managed narrative of heroic death in the line of duty. The details of the flight, the schedule, the escort, and above all the precision of the American interception were omitted from the public account. The Navy's internal investigation was not disclosed. The American historian Samuel Eliot Morison, writing in his multi-volume history of United States naval operations in the Second World War, later assessed Yamamoto's death as the equivalent of a major defeat in battle for Japanese morale and strategic capability. That assessment was shared by Nimitz's staff at the time. The strike had been authorized not as an act of revenge for Pearl Harbor, but as a calculated removal of the one Japanese commander the Americans judged capable of innovative strategic thinking under pressure. And within the Japanese Naval Command, a question had already begun circulating that no one could answer. How had the Americans known? The Imperial Japanese Navy designated the loss the Navy A incident. The clinical filing name itself reveals something about how the institution absorbed the catastrophe. The event was not classified as a security investigation. It was not assigned to the Navy's code section for a technical review. It was catalogued as an operational loss, processed through the bureaucratic language of an organization that approached its own internal assumptions with deference rather than skepticism. The inquiry was conducted by officers of the Combined Fleet Staff and the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. They examined several explanations. Commander Watanabe's precaution about Army channels gave the investigators their most attractive theory. The Itinerary, as Watanabe had discovered to his dismay after the shootdown, had been relayed through an Army communications circuit using a cipher the Navy considered inferior. The Army system used a different code architecture and was, in the Navy's institutional judgment, maintained with less discipline. If the Americans had intercepted the schedule, the investigators reasoned, they had done so through the Army's compromised system, not through JN-25. A second theory pointed to the Allied Coastwatcher network. Australian and New Zealand intelligence officers operated behind Japanese lines across the Solomon Islands, hiding in the jungle with portable radio sets, observing Japanese ship and aircraft movements, and transmitting reports to Allied headquarters at Guadalcanal. If a coast watcher near Rabaul had observed the preparations for Yamamoto's departure, the departure itself, or even the composition of the flight, that information could have reached American air controllers in time to launch a patrol. The theory had the advantage of requiring no breach of Japanese cipher security. A third explanation was coincidence. The Americans had been sending fighter patrols over the Bougainville area for months. Perhaps a sweep had simply crossed Yamamoto's path at the wrong time. Officers who favored this theory minimized the precision of the interception. Officers who did not pointed to the improbable arithmetic of 16 American fighters arriving at the exact point and minute of the Admiral's descent toward Balhail, on a heading that placed them between the Japanese formation and the airfield, after a flight of more than 400 miles from Guadalcanal. Coincidence, they argued, did not produce that kind of geometry. But the fourth explanation, the correct one, was never accepted. The idea that the Americans had broken JN-25 itself, that they were reading the Imperial Navy's primary operational cipher in something close to real time, was a conclusion the investigation would not reach. The code section's contribution to the inquiry, to the extent it has been documented, consisted of reassurances. The additive book had been changed only 12 days before the message was sent. The new additives had not been in use long enough, in the section's judgment, for a pattern-based attack to succeed, and the Japanese language, layered beneath the mathematics, made penetration by Western analysts effectively impossible. These reassurances reflected the institutional consensus, but they did not reflect the operational record. The Americans had demonstrated foreknowledge of Japanese intentions at Midway in June 1942, ambushing a carrier force whose composition and timing they had predicted with startling accuracy. Japanese investigators after Midway had reached a similar set of conclusions, attributing the American advantage to reconnaissance, submarine patrols, and lucky positioning rather than to code-breaking. The pattern of American tactical foresight in the Solomons throughout the second half of 1942 and the first months of 1943, the repeated appearance of American air and naval forces at precisely the right place and time, had drawn no systematic review from Japanese naval intelligence. Each instance was explained individually. No one examined the pattern as a whole. The code section's assurances after the Yamamoto shootdown fit into an established practice of explaining away evidence that pointed toward a conclusion the institution could not accept. No one in the Japanese naval intelligence structure proposed the obvious experiment, attempting to break JN-25 from the outside to see whether the premise of unbreakability actually held. The Americans reinforced Japanese confidence with deliberate and sustained deception. In the days and weeks following the shootdown, Mitch's command sent P-38 patrols over the Balhail and Bougainville area repeatedly, manufacturing a pattern of routine fighter sweeps along the coast that would make the Yamamoto interception look like one sortie among dozens, rather than a targeted strike built on precise intelligence. The sweep pattern was calculated to suggest that American fighters had been patrolling the area before April 18 and would continue to patrol it afterward, establishing a normalcy that the Yamamoto mission could hide within. No American official acknowledged the Admiral's death at any level. The pilots had been briefed before the mission that the intelligence came from Australian coast watchers operating near Rabaul, and most of them accepted the cover story without question or further curiosity. But some talked. Captain Lanfear's open radio transmission on the return flight to Guadalcanal, celebrating the kill in language the Japanese could have monitored on American voice frequencies, infuriated the chain of command. The Navy had originally submitted Major Mitchell for the Medal of Honor. According to Samuel Cox of the Naval History and Heritage Command, the award was downgraded to the Navy Cross before approval, because senior officers were so angered by the loose talk that they refused to elevate the mission's public visibility. 6 months later, in October 1943, the secret came within inches of public exposure. Time magazine published an account of the mission that included details, the long-range flight, the precise interception, the foreknowledge of the target's schedule, that pointed unmistakably toward signals intelligence as the source. American security officials were alarmed. The disclosure echoed an earlier security scare in June 1942, when the Chicago Tribune had published a story after the Battle of Midway that implied the Americans had been reading Japanese naval codes. That earlier incident had prompted a federal grand jury investigation, though no charges were filed. The Time article in October 1943 was less explicit than the Tribune story, but it carried the same risk. If Japanese intelligence officers read it carefully, the inference was available. The Japanese were not alarmed. Officers who saw or heard of the article reportedly continued to attribute the interception to coastwatchers, Army communications laxity, or the fortunes of war. The institutional conviction that JN-25 was impenetrable was so deeply held that even a near-public disclosure in a major American magazine, reaching millions of readers in a country with an active Japanese intelligence presence in neutral capitals, did not prompt a re-examination. The Code section was not asked to review its earlier assurances. The Navy A incident file was not reopened. The cipher remained unchanged. The investigation was closed. If this channel is where you come for the documented record, the subscribe button is what brings the next one to your feed. You subscribe, the next document arrives. Now back to what the Japanese chose not to see. The post-war record is as remarkable for its silences as for its disclosures. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, the very officer who had drafted and transmitted the fatal itinerary, was interrogated in Tokyo on October 15, 1945 by Captain C. Shands of the United States Navy as part of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Interrogation Navigation Number 13, Number 96. Watanabe had been promoted during the war and spoke fluent English. He answered questions about the planning for Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, and the Solomons campaign with professional directness over the course of a detailed session. The published transcript runs to dozens of pages. It does not contain a single question about the Yamamoto shootdown. It does not contain a single question about cipher security. It does not contain a single reference to the Navy A incident. The omission was not an accident. In October 1945, 6 weeks after the formal surrender, American intelligence was still actively protecting the secret that JN-25 had been compromised. Japanese officers were being debriefed across the Pacific, and the concern within the intelligence community, noted in the Associated Press account published across American newspapers on September 10, 1945, was that officers who learned the truth about the code breaking might retreat into shame or silence before the debriefing process was complete. The full code-breaking origin of the Yamamoto mission was not publicly confirmed until that September 10 story, 5 months after Germany's surrender and a full month after Japan's. Even then, American intelligence officials wished the disclosure had been delayed further because they were still extracting operational knowledge from Japanese officers who did not yet understand how thoroughly they had been read. Watanabe's only remark during his interrogation that touched on the question of secrecy was a general observation, delivered without apparent awareness of its personal resonance. The people of Japan, he told his American questioner, are not trained to keep secrets, and important cabinet information was routinely spread by the members. He was describing his own role in the affair without knowing it. The irony ran deeper than Watanabe's personal case. The Americans who sat across the table from him in that October session knew, with documentary certainty, that the message Watanabe had drafted 18 months earlier had been read, translated, and acted upon within hours of transmission. They knew the names of the cryptanalysts who had broken it. They knew the chain of command that had authorized the strike. They held the working translation in their own archives. And they asked Watanabe nothing about any of it, because the secret of JN-25 was still, in October 1945, more valuable than any answer Watanabe could provide. The code-breaking capability that had killed Yamamoto was the same capability that had shaped the American victory at Midway, that had guided submarine operations against Japanese shipping through 1943 and 1944, that had informed the fleet dispositions at the Philippine Sea and later Gulf. Acknowledging it to a Japanese officer, even a cooperative one, risked compromising the methods and the institutional knowledge that American intelligence intended to carry forward into the post-war world. The most authoritative post-war assessment of what the Japanese understood and did not understand about American code-breaking came from Otis Carey, a United States Navy lieutenant who had grown up in Japan as the son of missionaries and who spoke Japanese with native fluency. Carey interrogated senior Imperial Japanese Navy officers immediately after the surrender and later summarized his conclusions for American intelligence historians. His judgment, cited by Layton in And I Was There and by subsequent scholars, was that Japanese naval officers never seemed to have considered seriously the possibility that the Americans were reading their codes. Not after the Yamamoto shootdown. Not after the American foreknowledge at Midway. Not after the persistent pattern of American tactical success across the Solomons that suggested intelligence far more granular than Coast Watcher reporting or aerial reconnaissance could provide. The assumption that the Japanese language formed an impenetrable barrier beneath the cipher layer was so deeply embedded in the institutional culture that no accumulation of circumstantial evidence was sufficient to displace it. Historian John Prados, in his 1995 study Combined Fleet Decoded, argued that this was not ordinary negligence but a structural failure of intelligence self-assessment. The Japanese Navy's code section never conducted an adversarial review of JN-25 security, the kind of internal red team exercise in which its own best analysts would attempt to break the system from the outside and report honestly on what they found. The premise of unbreakability was accepted as a given, and no institutional mechanism existed to subject it to honest scrutiny. Prados argued that the cultural dimension, the belief that Western minds could not process the Japanese language at the speed and depth required for real-time cryptanalysis, reinforced the mathematical complacency in a way that made the two assumptions mutually supporting and mutually resistant to correction. The Americans, for their part, invested enormous care in protecting this complacency, guarding the enemy's blind spot with the same rigor they applied to guarding the intelligence it produced. The JN-25 decode system was never rebuilt as a consequence of the Yamamoto shootdown. Updated with new additive books at intervals but never fundamentally re-engineered in its architecture, it continued to yield readable traffic to American intelligence for the remainder of the Pacific War. The same cipher that had carried Yamamoto's itinerary to his death carried Japanese fleet dispositions, convoy routes, submarine patrol assignments, and operational orders through the great carrier battles of 1944, through the Philippines campaign, through the last desperate months of the Okinawa defense. American commanders from Spruance to Halsey to Nimitz himself used intelligence derived from the broken cipher to position their forces with a consistency that the Japanese attributed to superior reconnaissance, to luck, to the sheer volume of American assets in the field, to anything other than the explanation that would have demanded a reckoning with the code section's assurances. Every assumption the Japanese Navy made about the security of its communications in April 1943 was still in place, unchallenged and uncorrected, in August 1945. The loss over Bougainville cost the Japanese Navy more than its most senior commander. It removed the one flag officer in the service who had measured American industrial power firsthand, who had walked through American shipyards and oil refineries and aircraft factories with his own eyes, and who had grasped in private what he could not say in public, that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Admiral Minichi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was assessed by Layton and by Nimitz's planning staff as a more cautious, less imaginative, and less dangerous commander. Layton had made this assessment explicitly when recommending the strike. Koga himself was killed less than a year later, on March 31, 1944, when his aircraft disappeared in a storm during a transfer flight from Palau. The Japanese designated that loss the Navy B incident. Koga's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, survived the crash and was captured by Filipino guerrillas along with the complete Japanese defensive operations plan for the Central Pacific, the document the Americans designated the Z Plan. It was another catastrophic intelligence loss, another set of operational secrets spilling into enemy hands because of assumptions the Japanese command structure would not revisit. The pattern persisted because the institutional reflex was always to explain the loss by some cause other than the one that was true. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the man who survived the Second Betty on April 18, 1943, recovered from his injuries over the course of nearly a year. He returned to operational command, and by 1945 led the 5th Air Fleet from Kyushu, directing kamikaze operations against the American fleet assembled off Okinawa. Throughout the final year of the war, Ugaki watched the Americans dismantle the Japanese defensive perimeter with a methodical precision that suggested intelligence far deeper than aerial reconnaissance or submarine sighting reports could account for. He recorded his frustrations in his diary, sometimes in passages of considerable bitterness. He did not connect them to the possibility that American signals intelligence was providing the commanders at sea with a continuous picture of Japanese dispositions, intentions, and movements. On August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito broadcast the imperial rescript accepting the Potsdam terms, Ugaki removed his rank insignia, climbed into the rear seat of a Yokosuka dive bomber at Oita Airfield, and led a final unauthorized kamikaze sortie toward Okinawa. His last diary entry, written minutes before takeoff, recorded his intention to follow Yamamoto in death. The aircraft was never confirmed to have reached its target. His diary, The Fading Victory that Goldstein and Dillon published 46 years later, ends with the words he wrote before that final flight. He never recorded, in any passage that has been published, that he suspected the Americans had broken the code. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto held the rank of admiral and the post of commander-in-chief of the combined fleet from August 1939 until his death on April 18, 1943, at the age of 59. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral and awarded the Grand Cordon of the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, the staff officer who sent the itinerary that killed him, survived the war and sat across a table from American interrogators who already knew what his message had set in motion and who never told him. Marine officer Alva Laswell and the cryptanalysts of the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific broke that message at Pearl Harbor in less than a day. The American working translation survives in the records of the National Security Agency. The original Japanese 5-digit code groups of the intercepted message remain classified or destroyed. The Japanese investigation file from the Navy A incident has never been fully published in any language. If what you heard here matters, a like is what keeps records like this from vanishing into the noise. Subscribe, and the next document finds you. The men who served the Imperial Japanese Navy sent their orders and their schedules in cipher, trusting the code to guard the words. The men who broke that cipher read those words in silence, and the silence held for decades. Both records survived. This is one of them.